My name is Steve Murphy, and this is the Law Business Insider. Each and every week, we bring you important guests and the issues behind them. And today, we are very fortunate to have two outstanding people on the show. Both of them are authors. One of them is Pamela Glasner. She has a book out, which is a bestseller, called Finding Emmaus. And we also have Dr. Peter Breggin on the show. He has a book called Medication Madness: a role of psychiatric drugs in cases of violence, suicide, and crime. Before I introduce our guest, I'm going to introduce my co-host, Jack Girardi, of the law firm of Girardi Keys. Welcome to the show, Jack.
Thank you, Steve. Nice to see you again.
We also have online right now Pam and Dr. Peter Breggin. Peter, how are you, both of you?
Oh, it's a pleasure
Hi,
to be
how are you?
on your show, Steve.
Very good. By the way, let me just give you a little background here. Peter happens to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, you happen to be known as the conscience of psychiatry. You're a medical doctor, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm a psychiatrist, and yes, I've been called the conscience of psychiatry. I've been doing reform work for 57 years.
Right, going back to as far as Prozac, right?
Oh, way before. I started out reforming state mental hospitals as a college student.
Okay.
Ran a giant program at Harvard, and then went into psychiatry after that. But I guess I got best known for being the one to take on Prozac and being the first to talk in depth
Good.
about violence and suicide from Prozac.
Good. Now, before...
Also stopping lobotomy. I did a campaign to stop lobotomy.
Very good. Now,
Early 70s.
before we get into your book, Pam, tell us how you two got together and what you do together in your careers.
How we got together? Well, actually, we got together on Facebook, if you can believe it. My book is.
I believe
Peter's work is all nonfiction. My book is historically, factually, and medically accurate, but my principal characters are fictional, so technically my book is fiction. And Peter and I have actually been working together very well because my book, because it is fiction, and because it does address the same issues, but it reaches a completely different population, because the people who would walk into a bookshop and look for a fictional story would not necessarily be the same people who would walk into a bookshop looking for Medication Madness.
Right.
So that's why we work. And then people send me these great emails saying, "Oh my God, I'm so glad you did this, because I really never had any idea."
Right.
So we get the same information across to two completely different populations.
Right, and in two different mediums, more or less, nonfiction as well as fiction. In fact, from your website, which is www.lodestar, is it? Lodestar?
Yes,
Which one?
is.
LODESTARRE.com. I'm going to quote something. It says, "For centuries, many individuals have been labeled as either mentally ill and have been treated with experimental drugs, inappropriate treatment, and torture. Today, even with all the modern science, we still treat individuals with special talents with a lack of concern or interest. The pharmaceutical companies own us. They make millions of dollars off of us, and really don't care if the medications are causing harm." So that will lead into your book, Finding Emmaus.
Right.
Go ahead.
One of the things, Steve, that's so amazing about the two of us is the basic correspondence of beliefs, even though we're relatively new friends. Pamela's book is a amazingly, beautifully written book about an empath, an individual who has incredible depths of empathy and who is then subjected to psychiatric abuse over centuries. It's a wonderful story. My work is about the importance of empathy, and the new organization that I've created is the Center for the Study of Empathic Therapy, and about how psychiatry, instead of giving empathy, abuses people. The themes are so deeply similar.
Mm-hmm. And tell us the story of your book, Pam.
The story of my book. Well, it's actually very dark. It's fictional, as I said, but historically, medically, and factually accurate. It's a story which is actually experienced through the lives of two people who discover in adulthood that they're not mentally ill, but are in reality extraordinarily gifted. And because of that, and because of the appalling things that happened to each of them during the time they believed themselves to be ill, they each embark on these personal journeys. One of them, Frank, in the 1600s, and the other one, Catherine, in the present day. And then comes the fictional part where they find a way to transcend time and death and meet each other, and then work together in present day to save the lives of millions of people who have been ostracized from society and are being victimized because they too are considered to be mentally ill. And the whole idea of that was that I took normal human behaviors and grouped them into these people, and they are normal, and then had them labeled mentally ill. And then in order for me to understand, so I could write about it intelligently, in order for me to understand what the mental illnesses were, I started doing research, and that's when I actually tripped over, accidentally, what goes on between the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and the pharmaceutical industry. And the more I read, the more appalled I became, and my book actually started to become a book of social advocacy, which was absolutely not what I had in mind when I first started writing it. And actually that's how I ended up finding Peter. I actually found Peter because he was in a documentary that I had seen, and I really wanted to meet him, and then I had an opportunity to, and it's been great. He and I just work so well together because we both feel so deeply about what we do, and like I said, I come at it from a fictional standpoint, but it seems to be coming off really well because we're about to make a movie out of it. I have it's hopefully coming out next year.
Pam, let me ask you. I appreciate the factual basis. The two characters, though, a 16th century man and then a 20th century woman. What inspired you to draw parallel lives between these two people? The historical person and the current one. Where did that come from? That's such a most unusual vehicle to tell your story.
Well, it was really an unusual thing. I wanted to kind of bring in how long we've been doing this. That this is not a recent phenomenon. Human beings, we're not a very tolerant creatures. And so I wanted to connect, just how, as far back as I could go, how long people have been treating or abusing people who are different. And I really wanted to do it in American history. People always say, write about what you know. So I figured, the entire story actually takes place in Wethersfield, Connecticut, although I changed the name to Weaver's Bridge. But Wethersfield, Connecticut, our history only goes back as far as like the early 1600s. I think it was founded in 1623 or something like that. And back then they were Puritans. And so what I did was and I'm not giving away any spoilers or anything, I had the character back then, Frank, the historical character, realize that he was not mentally ill and then create sort of a guidebook, the Lodestar, as to how to live with having extraordinary talents, so that so that other people would not be victimized. And that because so he wrote this wonderful book, and then because he's a Puritan and because people back then had a very, very set way of a very specific set of rules that they were allowed to follow, and anything that wasn't actually, if it wasn't addressed in the Bible, it had no place in their lives. So back then, printing a book about how to be in a world where you're different actually would have been considered heresy. So the book gets walled up, put away, and then it disappears into legend, and it's gone for 300 years until Catherine comes along and finds it, and then finds a way to find him because he's actually what I call the father of empathy. And it just what I wanted to do was I really wanted to make it. I did it that way because I wanted to make it timeless. I didn't want people to think, oh, this is done, like a 20th century or a 21st century phenomenon, because it's not. Human beings have been ostracizing and victimizing people who are different from them since human beings have been human beings, I think.
At least one part of your story, I would suggest, is a 20th century phenomena, and that's the pharmaceutical industry. Now, that's just my own sense. And certainly what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 decades has been even more dramatic about the control they've had. Am I right about that? Is that I'll throw that out to both of you.
Well, absolutely. I mean, but it's not really all that new. I mean, yes, the pharmaceutical industry, as it is right now, is a more recent phenomenon. But there were certainly potions and all kinds of made out of different components, but there were, we've been poisoning people and using like a 16th century version of a psychiatric drug for a very, very long time. It's not that isn't really all that new. But actually, Peter is really the better person to talk about that.
Yeah, and Peter, I want to ask you a question about that. Okay, currently you're a reformer, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. We have a state of affairs in America which works like this. A pharmaceutical company will go to the FDA, and they will provide tests. Often these tests are conducted in places like Nigeria or Timbuktu or something like that under, let's say, auspicious supervision. They admit these tests in, and they qualify a drug to be sold for a specific purpose. Now, Jack works at a law firm, and they do many things at this law firm, but one of the things that law firms like Jack's look at are cases where drugs have been misused, like they were with drugs like Zyprexa, for example, where it was approved for one specific purpose. And doctors ended up prescribing it for many different purposes, and this is off-label marketing of the drug, and it makes a tremendous amount of money for the pharmaceutical companies. So, as a reformer, Peter, it would seem to me that because doctors can prescribe anything they want, whether it's approved by the FDA or not, any kind of use of a drug, whether that use has been approved by the FDA, that something has to close the gap so that this off-label marketing of drugs and therefore the misapplication and misuse of drugs, which causes great harm amongst a lot of people, how can we stop that? How can that change?
Well, first of all, I think the problem goes all the way back to the fundamental process of developing and approving a drug. And at the present time, whether it's done in Nigeria or it's done in Chicago, the drug company is completely the controller for everything that happens in the process. And I've gotten inside these companies on product liability suits, and they simply do everything in their power to exaggerate the effectiveness and minimize the dangers of the drug. The FDA then allows them proprietary secrecy over the developmental processes, so when they get sued, they just agree to pay a certain amount of money, but to keep all the data hidden. As a result, the doctors who use it, whether off-label or correctly, have no idea what actually went into the process. Mm-hmm. They don't have any recourse to it unless it comes out through a product liability suit. I've gone to the FDA hearings and said, listen, why don't you talk to somebody like me? I actually know what is going on inside about Paxil or Prozac, and the FDA isn't interested. They prefer to be blind to the truth about what's going on.
I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop. Yeah, Peter, I'm going to
fundamental, I think, than
Peter,
other issues.
Peter, I'm going to stop you when you just said that. Why is that? Why is the FDA intentionally blind?
Well, I mean, historically, Steve, agencies that modify and control corporations end up being modified and controlled by the corporations. Right. I mean, we saw this in the tragedy of the polluting of the Gulf. The agencies were going to dinner with the companies, not the drug companies in this case, but the oil companies. I think the best recourse we have is represented by people like Jack Girardi. We need to strengthen the capacity of the individual citizen or groups of citizens to get to bring suits and to get information. Information that bears on health should not be proprietary. It shouldn't be hidden, and we need to keep strengthening the legal process in that regard in general. The whole notion of tort reform is actually interfering with this process of giving us safety, because the almost everything we know that's really bad about drugs, we've pulled out of the companies in lawsuits.
Doctor, you make an interesting point. Our law firm has been involved in a number of the drugs, Avandian, Vioxx, and Zometa, and a number of them. And invariably you find out, once the records are revealed, the records that may be boxes and boxes, but once that were submitted to the FDA, and of course the FDA, lacking in the resources as they are, don't have the ability to examine it. But when you get a team of lawyers dedicated, or a team of people who are interested in representing the rights of consumers, when they examine the records, they do indeed find those risks and those problems that manifest themselves during the trial phase, which were never reported. And I'm sure you've seen that in your work as well.
Oh, again and again. It's in, I've written about 20 books, and about 10 of them are about that in one degree or another, how the internal processes give away way ahead of time what the FDA doesn't want to see. I mean, for example, one simple example, Eli Lilly, the manufacturer of Prozac, was asked by the Germans, not the Americans, to look at their clinical trials for suicidality. They found a vast increase in suicide attempts in their trials, and then just didn't tell the Germans and didn't tell the FDA. And when I told the FDA, they weren't interested. They didn't want to go outside their box.
So, and by the way, I did a story on Zyprexa, and I see that Zyprexa was manufactured by Eli Lilly. It was manufactured by Wyeth.
They're marvelous.
Yeah, and they made, I think it was close to $39 billion, something like that. And they paid a fine of $1 billion. And so they know the cost of doing business. So this basically, Peter.
This is about the diabetes issues, right?
Yeah, this isn't going to change, is it?
No, I don't want to take up all Pam's time.
I understand. But here's the thing. But here's the thing. As I
do a legal show later. Yeah.
Yeah. As I look at your book, Pam, I see that this was kind of an unconscious intent to bring this out to the public anyway, wasn't it?
Well, I wanted. Well, actually, it wasn't unconscious. After a while, when somebody is an empath, which is what my main characters are, an empath is somebody who experiences the emotions of other people as though those emotions were their own, but there's no information that comes with it. It's just the emotions. And so what happens is that the people who are very sensitive to other people's emotions have these gigantic mood swings. Mm-hmm. Well, what is the mental illness equivalent of that is bipolar, right? Mm-hmm. Bipolar disorder.
So bipolar people are empaths?
No. Well, I have to be very careful about that, because I've had people calling me up or sending me emails saying, "Oh my God, I'm getting off my drugs now because you've said I'm an empath." So I've got to be really careful about that, because I would never advocate for somebody to just flush their drugs down the toilet because they'll kill themselves. But from what I've learned, these conditions are manufactured just the same way the medications are, and I think Peter would agree with me on that.
Now, Pam, I want to ask you this question. You could have written a book about anything. Why this book? Are you bipolar?
Oh, no, I'm not, and I don't have anybody in my family who is. I'll tell you honestly, I sat down, I write longhand. I sat down with a pen and a pad, and 5 months later, stuck my face in it, and 5 months later I had this amazing book, and I don't know where most of what I wrote came from. It was like it just came down into my head, down through my arm, and ended up on the paper. It was amazing.
Had you ever written a book before?
No, this is my very first book. I just sat down and wrote 765 pages.
How's the book doing?
It's doing very well, thank you.
Talk to us.
It's doing very well, and like I said, I'm making a. Well, I'm not, but I mean, we're making a movie out of it.
Yeah, and talk to me about that. Who's making a movie, and when is that happening?
It's an independent production company, and although we'll probably have studio distribution, and actually we're talking about that right now. In fact, I just got an email a little while ago. So I'm hoping we're going to start working on it, going into pre-production this year so that it'll come out. Well, I think it'll end up either coming out the end of this year or maybe next year, because we want to time. It's a trilogy,
right.
And so we need to time the release of book 2 with the release of the film.
The book two hasn't been written yet, right?
Oh yeah, a good part of it has.
Okay.
Yeah.
Pam,
I'm working on that right now.
Pam, that's what I was going to ask you. If you find yourself 700 pages into it, and then you can't just stop writing at that point. How do the second and third books of the trilogy take us? In what direction do they take us?
Well, I don't want to tell you too much.
No,
about
that was a real general
give
question, right? No, sure.
But I actually had the entire story in my head in about 15 minutes, and I must have been about 250 or 300 pages into finding Emmaus, and I realized, boy, this is going to be one really long book. And most booksellers, the actual stores or the book buyers, the ones who buy the books for the Barnes and Nobles or whatever, most of them, they don't like to have, or they prefer not to have huge books because it takes up a lot of real estate on the shelves.
Right.
So I just have found a likely spot for a commercial break and ended the book, and so that's where book 2 kind of picks up. And then it was only going to be 2 books, and then somebody said to me, if you do this and such at the very end of book 2, that would be a great cliffhanger ending. I said, oh my God, you're right, what a great idea. So then it became, now I know that there's going to be a book 3, but I don't really know what book 3 is going to be. I just know I've got a great cliffhanger ending that leads into it. Yeah.
Prior to you feeling the need to write this book, were you involved at all with anything similar to this?
I was actually restoring vintage, blighted apartment buildings and then providing safe and decent housing for men coming out of prisons and shelters. So about as far removed as you can imagine.
Yeah. So what event happened? I'm going to give you some alternatives. Was there a lightning bolt? I'm not being facetious here. I mean, did something happen in your life which caused you to take a totally different direction?
Yes, well, it wasn't an actual occurrence in my life, but I had gone to a silent retreat with some people in my parish, and that was kind of a scary thing for me because I never don't talk, and the thought of going away.
I was going to ask, what do you do at a silent retreat?
The one thing you don't do is speak. And I was thinking, how am I going to be?
Well, let me ask you this question. Seriously, I'm not being. If you don't talk at a silent retreat, why are you all together?
Because community is very, very important, whether you're speaking or not.
Well,
right?
what do you do? Do you do events?
You pray and you eat, and there's a wonderful thing about being in community. In fact, to me, it's even more special when you're not obliged to speak, because when you stop speaking and you stop having all of that external noise around you, or at least for me, when all the rest of that external noise stopped, all those voices and all the rest of that stuff, and the place was just so incredibly peaceful and quiet, what I realized was that I was being bombarded by a whole lot of internal noise that I wasn't even aware of. Mm-hmm. And when I got rid of the internal noise was when I was finally able to sit down and say, oh my God, I'm going to write a book. Wow. I swear to God, that's what happened. I just said, I have a story in my head.
How long was the retreat, by the way?
3 days.
3 days. So at the end of 3 days, was it exactly at the end of 3 days or someplace during the 3 days?
It was pretty much at the end of 3 days because I went away with a question in my head. I had a very, very serious thing going on in my life, and I went with this, I'm going to go there and hopefully I'll get a solution to my problem. And a day and a half in, I remember thinking to myself, my God, I only have a day and a half left, and I'm no closer to an answer than I was when I left my driveway. Mm-hmm. And then at the end of it, all of a sudden, like you say, a lightning bolt, and then I realized that I had known the answer before I ever left my driveway. But there was just so much external and internal noise, I didn't let myself know that I knew. And that was when I was able to come home and just sit down. And I'd always wanted to write a book, but I used to sit down in front of a piece of paper and think, what could I possibly say for 300 pages that anybody would want to listen to?
Well, you were sitting in the right place. That's obvious, right? Now, we have 1 minute left, and we promised that Peter wouldn't talk anymore. Just kidding, Peter. We kept our promise, didn't we? He's the one who volunteered that. So, in the time we have remaining, please give out your website, Pam, and also Peter, please.
Pam,
Okay, thank you, Peter. Well, it's www.lodestar, LODESTARRE.com.
Okay.
And I'm Pamela Glasner.
And they can order your book from the website, too?
Yes, or Amazon, or they can go to their favorite Barnes & Noble.
And it's Finding Emmaus.
Finding Emmaus, EMMAUS.
Now, Medication Madness, the role of psychiatric drugs in cases of violence, suicide, and crime, published by St. Martin's Press. Can people buy it on Amazon, too?
Oh, yeah. Amazon's a good place to go.
Okay. Do you have a website?
My name is spelled Breggin. My website is simply Breggin.com, Breggin.com. And we have a wonderful upcoming in April international conference on empathic therapy.
Wow.
It's going to be in Syracuse.
On this program, we're going to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I also want to thank my co-host, Jack Girardi, a partner at the law firm of Girardi Keys. Thank you for being on here, Jack.
Steve, you're welcome.
And would you kindly give out your website and telephone number, please?
I would do that. The firm's phone number is in the 213 area, 977-0211. The website, www.girardikeys.com.
Thank everyone for listening. You can get more information about the guests, their books, the show, Jack Girardi at www.lbishow.com. Thank you.